Hi, it's Brendan here. Before we get into this week's show, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder about Spiked Supporters. Spiked Supporters is our way of giving back to those of you who support our work. Spiked has no paywall and no subscriptions. We rely on the generosity of listeners and readers like yourself to keep us going and growing. Sign up to become a Spike supporter today, and you'll not only help Spike to reach more people with our pro-freedom, pro-democracy message, you'll also get some exciting perks in return, including discounts on events, discounts in our shop, and much more besides. To find out more about becoming a Spike supporter, just go to spiked-online.com/supporters. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.
The more you have a preoccupation with identitarian concerns and hyper-racialism, the less you're talking about housing, the less you're talking about industry. You know, the consequences of dividing people, putting one group against another, preoccupation, constant raising the racial temperature over everything is a total distraction. These are luxury opinions, you know, and the fact that so many very, very rich corporations and individuals have embraced this stuff should be a little indicator that, you know, it suits them. You know, it gets people off the subject of economic inequality.
Hello and welcome to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill. This is a podcast in which an esteemed guest joins me to talk about the big ideas, the bad ideas, the problems and the controversies of life in the early 21st century. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by William Clouston. William is the leader of the UK's Social Democratic Party. He first joined the SDP in 1982. He's been a district councillor and a parliamentary candidate for the party, and he currently sits on the Corbridge Parish Council in Northumberland. William has been leader of the SDP since 2018, and he was re-elected as leader in March 2020. So, William, I want to talk to you over the next hour about the realignment of British politics and the changing nature of the left and the changing nature of the right and where you fit into this new spectrum. But to get us onto that journey of discussion, I want to kick off by asking you if you could just give our listeners a kind of a potted history of the Social Democratic Party, where it comes from, what you think it represents, and what its place is in contemporary politics. If you could just give us a brief outline of that history, and then we can kind of use that as a diving board to talk about those other issues.
Great. Well, the SDP is a Labour offshoot, so it's a thing of the left. And basically the sort of three-line history is that the Gang of Four started it. They were a very prominent Labour politicians, ex-Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary and Transport Secretary, four of them. They left the Labour Party in 81, and they started it, and they needed to change the system. The idea was that we'd break the system. So the sort of core thing with the SDP is to try and destroy the two-party system. And the subversive part of the SDP, which is very subversive, is the idea that you get rid of vested interest politics. So everyone knows that Labour is, you know, in the pocket of the unions and does the public sector's work. We've seen that in the pandemic, haven't we? And the Tories are in the pocket of big business and entrenched privilege. So the SDP's idea was that you can govern for everyone. And it's radical. It's quite a subversive idea, but the social market economy thing sort of was what we promoted then, and we still do. It should be possible to govern for the whole country. But basically, its economics is of the left. And I think over the last sort of 40 years since we started, there's been a drift towards a reaction against liberal overreach. I think so. Where we are, I mean, the way I'd sort of describe it is the party was knocked to the grassroots after Owen left in 1990. And, you know, we live to fight another day, and we're fighting another day. And there is room for us. I think probably about half the public broadly agree with our approach, which is left-wing economics and a fairly traditional attitude towards sort of family, community, nation, the things that we do together.
One of the big questions I have for you is how we shatter the two-party system, because I completely agree with you that really needs shattering. So I want to come back to that in a moment. Yeah. But just to carry on from with this issue of the SDP and where it fits in. So I want to ask you about the realignments that are taking place in British politics, which seem to me to be quite drastic and interesting and exciting and unpredictable as well. So on the one hand, we have a Conservative Party that is very different to the Conservative Party I remember when I was growing up, when I was a child in the Thatcher years, and the Conservative Party was considered to be very free marketeer, very neoliberal, didn't particularly care about working class communities. That was the distinct impression we had of the Thatcher government. Now you have a Conservative Party that is interested in big spending, which is always trying to appeal to the red wall parts of the country where it got many of its votes in 2019, which says F big business, not wanting to use rude words on the podcast. And then on the other side, you have a Labour Party, which is in thrall in many ways, or at least it was in thrall to the neoliberal European Union, which buys into the politics of wokeness, the politics of identity, which seem to grate very explicitly against the politics of class and particularly what working class communities are interested in. So there's been this huge kind of earthquake, it seems, in British politics where the right is no longer like it once was, and the left is no longer like it once was either. Is that how you see it too, or do you have a different understanding of what's taken place over the past 20 or 30 years?
I think it's happened more recently than that, in a sense. I think the difference between Blair and Cameron Osborne was negligible, literally nothing. So I think largely the changes that we're seeing now, the Tory party is being sort of dragged kicking and screaming into it. Let's deal with the Tories first. So I think there is a basic tension. It's a pragmatic organization. Its main aim is to be in power. And you've got a situation where the Labour Party has literally turned its back and, demonized its core patriotic working class vote. It despises these people, as Paul Embrick rightly says, and it has no right to those votes. And people took a little bit of time, but they got onto it and they gave Labour the flick. So Labour's lost that, and that's a rotation. It's not a swing. It's very important to grasp that. We're accustomed to think about politics in terms of swings, but that's a cultural rotation, similar to the Democrats using the southern states in the 60s. You're not going to get those back almost under any circumstances. I think they've lost them. I think the public, I stood in Leeds in the 2019 election, and the contempt which the ordinary members of the public had in South Leeds on council estates for Labour was astonishing. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. All the students who are, campaigning for Labour didn't want to come anywhere near those estates. And so they're really toast, literally toast. They've done it. And also, Brendan, when you treat people like that, people feel it in the heart. Yeah. So it's not a thing. It's not a pragmatic thing. Oh, well, I might vote Labour because they'll do this for me. No, it's a brutal thing. So they're finished in those communities. The Tory party has sort of inherited a lot of seats in the red wall without really being on top of them politically, apart from Brexit. So they were on top of them on Brexit, but economically they've got a fair way to go. And there's a huge tension in the Tory party now between some red wall new Tory MPs, which are pretty much like us, Brendan. I mean, they're pretty, Simon Clarke and MP for Mansfield and so on, Ben Bradley, they're pretty much like us. But you've still got the Knights of the Shires, you've still got the Econ Liberals in the Tory party, and they, I would describe them as the slow learners, because we've tried that. And what's happened over the last sort of 30, 40 years is we've had open markets, and we've deindustrialized, we've gutted our industrial capacity. I mean, manufacturing is down to 9% now. And you saw this in the pandemic when the government was sort of scrabbling around for supplies, slightly pathetic. So we tried that. China's won the day, actually, on that. And the whole of the West is suffering. You only have to look at Philly and Pittsburgh and Cleveland, Ohio, Youngstown in the States to see this. So the Econ Liberals are sort of having a sort of moment of saying, oh Lord, what's happening? And that model's shattered. And just from a sheer practical geopolitical point of view, that model is gone. You can't run your system with open markets trading, with industrial supplies made by slavery. It's not on. It's not on, ecologically. It's not on morally. But economically it's not on, because basically you just destroy yourself. So I think it's very interesting if you listen to people like John Redwood and you listen to people like David Davis. They're quite thoughtful, and I think the penny's dropping that the model is gone. So you've got a sensible government now would fairly quickly look at reshoring, reindustrialization, and you'd look at some trade friction, which is very interesting because remember in the debate about Brexit, there was a sort of public discourse about trade deals that was about, sort of fairly superficial level. They had the debate, and if you didn't have a trade deal, you couldn't trade. Well, what never occurred to a lot of the commentators was that you actually want a little bit more trade friction. I wouldn't have a trade deal with the United States. We have a trade surplus with the United States now. If you had a trade deal with them, your financial services would go, you wouldn't have much farming left. And it's just not in your interest to. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's taking time. I don't know, Brendan, how long it will take for the econ liberals and the Tory party to make the turn. But the model's been tried. It's gutted our industry. It's wrecked society in the North and the Midlands, and it's gone. So I think some of the Northern Red Wall Tory MPs get it. But, someone like Liz Truss, who's a sort of walking trade deficit, doesn't get it.
Okay, well, let's take the two parties, I should say, the two parties whose domination of British politics we want to dislodge. And let's take them one at a time. So firstly, the Tory party, you've been talking about there, and I think that's a very good description of where the Conservatives are at. And I think one mistake that some people make, and I sometimes fall into this trap myself, is to think, well, the Labour Party is very, very divided, and we can come on to that in a moment. It's obviously very divided between Corbynistas and the right wing of the Labour Party, and of course, it's working class voters who have revolted and left it and so on. So we see the Labour Party as very broken apart and divided and confused. And then I think some people have a tendency to view the Conservative Party as being very different to that and being in power, in control, having a clear sense of itself. But that's obviously not true. And I think underneath the fact that this is a government that had a very large mandate in the 2019 general election, it is a very divided party. There are the neoliberal forces. There are the new Red Wall MPs, as you describe, who have a clearer understanding, I think, of what working class communities want. There's the kind of middling ground, which could include Boris Johnson, who don't really know which way to swing and might swing rather opportunistically from one day to the next, from supporting the business side to supporting the Red Wall side. So if we look at all those kind of tensions and confusions within the actual governing party, one question I wanted to ask you is, how successfully could the Conservative Party ever represent working class communities? Because there are now some Conservatives who will openly say, we are the party of the working class. A larger number of working class people vote for us rather than voting for Labour, so that's where we're at. Is it possible that the Tories can ever represent the working classes, or is that just a non-starter from the very beginning?
I think what I would concede is that obviously I think 57, nearly 60% of the Labour Party membership is graduates, and the level is lower for the Tories. And I think now, obviously, Matt Goodwin, I think it was equal in 2017, but now 2019, partly because of Brexit, the Tories convened more working class votes. But that doesn't, I wouldn't trust the Tory party. I had 4 years in the Tory party, as active social democrat in the 80s, and a friend got me involved. And it's just a sort of pragmatic, almost value-free zone, really. It's an odd fish. Point that Peter Hitchens always says about, conservatives. The Conservative Party he describes as the principal obstacle to conservatism, and he's right. So I don't know. I doubt it, Brendan. I just don't think it has it in it to defend the interests of the working class. And there's been no hint of it anyway over the. If you look at the post-war period, for a period in the 50s, Macmillan, when you had the solidarity from the Second World War. And the program that Attlee started, with house building, the health service, and Macmillan went along with that, but then it was broken pretty quickly. So we'll have to wait and see. I think let's go back to the point that you're always going to have these incoherent large entities in these massive parties, because we can't vote honestly. I mean, you can't vote honestly. And don't say that we don't have coalitions. The Tory party is a coalition and the Labour party is a coalition. And, so people always say, well, if you have voting reform, you have coalitions. We've got them now. Just depends whether you vote for them honestly prior to the election or you do your coalition first and then go to the government. You don't know what you're voting for. So I don't know. I mean, it literally is all over the place. I mean, my basic problem with both parties in the last sort of 20, 30 years is that they've been both completely enthralled to liberalism, economic liberalism and social liberalism. And there's not been very much between them. I mean, a key point, an absolutely killer point that Peter Shaw always used to make about the Labour Party in relation to its fondness with the European Union is that the European Union is structured to make social democracy, the sort of social democracy I want, it's structured to make that impossible. I mean, if I wanted to keep a steel plant open, we were in the EU, couldn't do it. So my sort of type of economic program requires that a nation state is active and is capable. And for years the Labour Party were backing the EU, and they, as Shaw said, they were backing an entity in the EU that would prevent them from implementing the Keynesianism that they profess to want. So the whole thing was shot. I mean, as I say, the Labour Party is shot full of, woke graduates who are just liberals of various kinds. They're so far away from, I think we're more economically left-wing than them, which isn't very difficult.
If you've tried and failed to get healthier, there's no point beating yourself up about it. Strict diets and exercise routines often start off fine, but they're hard to keep up. If you're looking for serious long-term results, then you need to try Noom. Noom helps you understand your mind and body so you can develop new habits and make changes that last. You only need to spend 10 minutes a day on Noom to feel the difference. It's taught me that it's okay to have off days and there's no such thing as bad food. The Noom app gives you access to loads of different recipes for inspiration, and it also makes it easy and fun to log what food you've eaten and to see your progress. And best of all, it is so easy to integrate Noom into everyday life. It really takes the stress out of healthy living. Best of all, Noom is completely tailored to your needs, your goals, and your personality. If you're a data geek, for instance, Noom can give you some incredibly detailed insights into your health. Or if you're a people person, you can speak to a Noom coach to get that extra motivation you need. Don't just take my word for it. More than 80% of Noom users finish their personalized program, and more than 60% end up sticking to their goals for more than a year. So, lose the weight for good. Sign up for your trial at noom.com/Brendan. That's NOOM.com/Brendan. So on the Labour Party then, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about Labour. I spend much of my life in a state of complete bewilderment as to what has become of the Labour Party. And you touched on this earlier, the fact that it's not simply that Labour no longer understands working class communities, but it is now actively hostile to them. You can see this. I mean, you mentioned the estates in Leeds where the young woke middle class Labour canvassers didn't dare to tread. And I've heard very similar stories about parts of London too. They will go to somewhere like Bermondsey, for example. They'll go to the hyper trendy places that have been super gentrified, but they won't go anywhere near the estates in Bermondsey where the English flag flies from every window and where people have rather different views to your average Corbynista. And there is this extreme hostility as captured in words like gammon. I find gammon such an obnoxious term. Yeah. To me, it essentially means pig, pig meat. Yeah. They refer to significant sections of our society as pig meat, essentially, because they hold certain views or they're seen as being insufficiently politically correct. Just give us your view of how this shift came about. Now, it's my personal view that Labour was never the best friend of the working class and there were always problems with how the Labour Party interacted with working class communities. But there has, even from my perspective, there has been a palpable deterioration in how Labour views working class communities. And it is now pretty hostile to them and contemptuous towards them. Give us your view about how you think that came about and how bad you think that relationship has now got?
Well, it's finished, the relationship. It's gone and it won't come back. How did it come about? I think it probably came about due to the sort of intellectual journey, the sort of Rawlsian rights-based approach. Intellectually, I think a lot of people just thought everything was about rights, my rights, individual rights, and that's been prioritized, I think, in their thinking. But they've just forgot about us. They've forgot about solidarity. And if everything's about rights, they're slightly scared of solidarity, though, Brendan, as well. They don't like, I mean, some of them just aren't very bright, I think, in a practical sense. They just don't get the things they profess to want, like the National Health Service or convening national solidarity to do something like build houses. Housing's the biggest macroeconomic failure. The Labour Party did nothing about it. They weren't interested. They didn't build any council houses. Funnily enough, the council that I chair is just building 4 now. You can do it if you want to do it, but they never wanted to do it. So, they've got themselves into a real pickle. They're just liberals of various kinds. They've forgotten that if you don't have any solidarity, you don't end up sharing anything. If you can't share things, there's no health service. There's a national health service. And, again, if you prioritize internationalism, open borders, me all the time, you just lose any grasp, any connection with the fact that we're in it together. And and working class communities understand this because they depend on it. You're in it together. You need solidarity. And even a basic thing, if you speak to, Leeds, I was up against the son of a Labour grandee that I rather respect, Tony Benn, but I fought Hillary Benn in the election. We had a hustings at the university, and those university students just didn't know what I was on about when I was talking about the nation state. They were so hostile to the idea of the nation state, which they make it virtually equivalent to racism to want to prioritize a fellow citizen. So I can't see any way that they can come back from it. But funnily enough, there is a little ray of optimism in all of this, which I like to talk about, which is that a lot of people say what we're doing it hasn't got much chance and so on. I think it's a perfectly rational reaction to looking at something you're not very happy with and trying to change it. I think that's what we should do. And I think our future as a party depends on PR. And I think PR will come, and I'll explain why. I think the electoral dynamics are such that the Labour Party, having lost Scotland and the Red Wall, can't win a general election. The first past the post system survives because both parties benefit. If you get a situation, Brendan, where one of them suddenly doesn't benefit, it's over. The sort of stitch up is over. There's no point in them doing it. And you see this in a lot of Labour members, and you see a very unreported thing at the Labour Party conference, a month and a half ago, was that 80% of constituency Labour parties voted for PR. And the Union Bloc vote stopped it. I think PR is going to happen. I think the Labour Party is stupid enough to lose maybe 1, maybe 2 elections more, but you can't have a situation where you have a one-party state. I think it'll give. So I think there's a sort of glint of light there. And all I want is for the British people to be able to vote honestly.
It strikes me that the case for proportional representation is so obvious. I'm surprised we have to continue making it. I mean, there are so many good examples of ridiculous things that have happened in British politics that would not have happened in the same way if we'd had proportional representation. I mean, if you think about the 2015 general election where UKIP, whatever we may think of UKIP, I'm sure we have our various disagreements with it, it wins 12.5% of the vote and gets 1 seat in Parliament, 1 seat out of 650. And it's just such an obvious wrong in political life. And I think one of the issues, I think, with the two-party system is, as you say, Labour and the Tories are essentially coalitions, but there's a large element of dishonesty in it. So instead of honestly saying, well, we are blue Labour over here and we are Corbynista Labour over here and we're going to be our own parties and we're going to actually battle against each other for people's votes, or the Tory party also drifting off into its various different wings as well, they're held together as these dishonest coalitions almost, which benefit from the fact that they know that come election day, it will be one of those two parties that gets past the post and gets power. So what do you think, just sticking on this particular topic of electoral reform for a moment, what do you think is there's the obvious barrier that the two traditional parties benefit from this system and therefore are reluctant to have serious reform. But do you think there is a public resistance or perhaps a public misunderstanding of how destructive the two-party system is? What do you think it will take to break that barrier and have that, ideally, a referendum on changing this?
I think the barrier will be broken by the fact that the system, as I said before, people aren't paying attention to it, but it is a stitch up, and it only works if both big parties benefit. The moment one party can't form a government and winner take all, they may as well do it. I mean, Labour MPs are now saying, well, if we had, 60% of people didn't vote Tory, we could cozy up to the SNP, and the Greens and the Liberal Democrats have some ghastly rainbow alliance. They're obviously thinking that way, and they will think that way. And as I say, I think it's probably just an electoral fluke. The dynamics of Scotland going to the SNP. Again, I can't see Labour getting those seats back. They might chip away a little bit, but they're not going to take them. The Tories have as good a chance of getting some of those seats as the Labour Party. And so, it's out of the game. Labour is not in the first past the post game anymore. People haven't woken up to it. It's fine. I mean, they'll wake up to it eventually. I mean, they'll lose another couple of elections, and then, as I say, you'll have it. If you have some sort of ghastly rainbow coalition, you better hope the SDP's in there, by that stage, because it'll be a pretty dreadful environment if we're not. So, there's so many arguments for, fair voting. The one you made just there, the actual base fairness of it is I first encountered that in the first election I worked on in 83. The SDP Liberal Alliance got 25.5% of the vote. Labour Party we got 23 seats. The Labour Party got 1.5% more than us, and they got 210 seats. It was ludicrous. Wow. I remember as a kid, there's a West Country Liberal MP called DC Penn-Halligan, David Penn-Halligan, who sadly died shortly afterwards. But he said, described it in a sort of Cornish accent as a gross perversion of justice. And he was right. He was right. I mean, no one could say it was fair. But I would say it just doesn't do what an election should do. Seats, it should broadly match votes. And you saw this in the Brexit situation. There wasn't, how many parties in Parliament, Brendan, supported what was the mainstream majority view? The mainstream majority view. And if there hadn't been so much, coercion, the mainstream majority view would have been a lot bigger. But, 52% of people voted for Brexit. The DUP, that was it. That was the only party in Parliament that supported the, and that was because these elites, basically, the gatekeepers of the selection system, have got these professionalized MPs that went to the same universities, think the same things, and they're just liberals everywhere. And I just think, and I said, it wouldn't be exactly like our party. We're pretty socially conservative, but there are social conservatives, Brendan, and they've got no one to vote for. Yeah. So what do you do? I really think it will change for this reason. So we'll wait and see.
Let's stick with the issue of electoral reform before I've got some questions I want to ask you about Brexit and wokeness and other issues of our time. But on the issue of electoral reform, there's another problem, of course, in my view anyway, which is the House of Lords. So, and you talked there about the obvious unfairness where people can vote in large numbers for a party and it's not reflected in the House of Commons in terms of seats. But then you also have a problem where if you look at, for example, the public's collapse of democratic faith in the Liberal Democrats, who have lost numerous seats in the House of Commons, lost numerous votes, and yet they are still there in the House of Lords. I don't know how many peers they have now, 90, 95 or whatever it is, and they will be there until they die, influencing lawmaking, amending laws, and having this impact. And that's a good example of the broader problem with the House of Lords, which it's this immovable object that you and I and everyone else in this country has no democratic authority over whatsoever. So isn't that akin to the Brexit issue, which I want to ask you further about soon? But it's akin to the Brexit issue in the sense that if we are serious about clearing away all the crap, I guess, that's standing in the way of people having a genuine sense of control over their lives and their community and their nation, the House of Lords has got to go, right?
Yeah, no, it's a no-brainer. It's an outrage that it's still there. It was an absurdity 120 years ago, and it's still an absurdity, and it is ridiculous. It's just literal inertia. I don't deny that in a sense of, as a sort of, revising chamber, it has some quite intelligent people in there and it does that job, but that's not, you can't accept the principle. Apart from anything else, the hereditary principle is ludicrous, the bishop's ludicrous, and the cronyism is the worst. You give 3 million quid to the Tory party, you become a life peer, you can affect legislation. It's an outrage. We are, fairly culturally traditional as a party, as most British people are. We support the monarchy as a sort of, because it adds to the gaiety of the nation. I think that's fine. But you can't support the House of Lords. You just can't. And our proposal is to try and finish the unfinished business of England being sort of country that's dangling there, left dangling with the devolution settlement in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And our view is you can't have an English Parliament and two chambers. If you sort of have an English Parliament, my preference would be an English Parliament with a Parliament in York. You have to be unicameral for the UK Parliament, and you can be. There are unicameral states. You have to have a different system for revising and challenging legislation, and scrutinising it, but that's a committee system. You can have an enhanced committee system to do that. You've got to get rid of the House of Lords. It is an absurdity. It really isn't. It just is sheer inertia and rot. Eventually, I think the whole lot's going to go the first past the post system and the House of Lords by the mid 2030s is going to go. You'll get another revolution.
Yes, the issue of a revising chamber or an advising chamber is a very interesting one. And I remember Matt Ridley, when he was on this podcast, and he's obviously a peer, he made a very interesting suggestion, which is that instead of having hereditary peers or the great and the good being selected by the government, how about we just open a phone book and stab a pen in it and pick the first 100 names that come up? And to many people that would sound shocking, but actually to me it sounds like a far more reasonable marshalling of the expertise of ordinary people to the end of going over these things. And I remember during the Brexit debate, there was so many newspaper headlines about the country's 100 top lawyers say that Brexit won't work, or the country's 100 top human rights activists say Brexit has. And I always thought to myself, what about the country's 100 top plumbers or 100 top bus drivers? Why do we not hear from them? Why are they not having this a similar impact in political life? So there's also a problem within all of this stuff we're talking about in terms of reform. There is a genuine problem in terms of this over-reliance on what is seen as expertise, which tends to come from a fairly narrow section of society, and this downplaying of the wisdom of the kind of people you will have encountered when you were canvassing in Leeds, the kind of people we meet every day. So there's also that question, isn't there, about how we utilise the wisdom of ordinary people? Well,
expertise is, Frank Furedi gave a great speech at the SDP conference, he touched on this. Expertise is being used as a means of giving power to technocrats and taking things off the table. It's Tina again. There is no alternative. That's what they're using it for. They try and take key issues off the table and try and sort of determine them almost pre-politically. So your ordinary person gets no purchase on them, can't actually get near these issues because you leave it to experts. And there's a very important distinction we should make, Brendan, between expertise here. And a lot of people don't think enough about this, which is that, there is expertise. You get told off if you say that you don't believe in expertise, but it's micro expertise. Macro expertise, it's a very important distinction to get. Open systems, economic predictions, or during the pandemic, making predictions about viral curves. This is not expertise in the same sense. You can't make predictions in open systems. It's a technical issue. You can't even judge the difference between magnitudes of co-cause and cause. So it's very difficult. That's not you might be a very intelligent person. You might be very clever, but you can't make predictions. I'll tell you who can make predictions: bakers, engineers, people that repair things. That's micro expertise, and that's genuine expertise. And you've got to concede to that because they can say, well, I fix that, that'll happen. And 99% of the time that's true. But I'm sad to say, a lot of the people that we're encouraged to look up to as experts, they might be quite clever, but they're not very wise quite often. They certainly can't predict things.
It always reminds me of one of the points that the Chartists made. The Chartists, obviously, heroes of ours, mine and yours, no doubt, who fought for the right of working class men to vote in the 1800s. And one of the points they always made was, look, we're not saying that the ordinary working man is just as good as the Lord in terms of working out what's best for society. We're saying that he's better. And he's better at working these things out precisely because he lives in society in a way that lords often don't, and in a way that technocrats these days often don't. He understands how society works. He understands where it's going wrong. He has direct experiences of these problems. And that was seen as the kind of the democratic cry of the time. And so that makes me want to ask you to come back to the issue of Brexit and what you think Brexit represented, because as you and I will know, it's Brexit. The vote for Brexit has been demonized a lot. We're told that it is the vote of xenophobes and gammon and people who are nostalgic for empire, even though we're voting to leave a neo-empire. So that doesn't quite make sense. So it's been demonized in all these different ways. But you talked earlier about the importance of solidarity and the misunderstanding of solidarity among sections of the Labour left and the elites more broadly. Brexit fundamentally was an attempt to restore a culture of solidarity, the politics of solidarity. Do you think?
Yeah, no, totally. That's what it was. I mean, it was a cry to say enough to cosmopolitanism, indifference about what is made where and by whom, indifference about where anyone goes, and literally an indifference to the place you live. That's what it was a revolution against. It was a proper revolution. People had had enough about that. And I agree, it was a cry for solidarity and sharing. And when people mock people in Sunderland for being thick and voting for Brexit and the Nissan factory is going to close and all this sort of thing, well, that didn't happen. I mean, that was just yet another one of those Project Fear things. But even if people in Sunderland did vote, knowing that there would be a consequence in the short term, that was in the bargain. That was worth doing to get something back, to reassert a sense that we can decide ourselves. But it was, so there's many things to Brexit. But yeah, I totally agree. Solidarity, calling time on liberal overreach, and just wanting to reestablish some basics in national self-governance and things like that, which had just been taken off the table. And people knew that they couldn't affect, a lot of, as I said, as John Gray says a lot, a lot of stuff had been decided to be taken off the table pre-politically, and people knew that. They sort of felt the sense of powerlessness. You can't, there's no, you can vote for any government, but it's all wrapped up in the treaties and so on. People had enough of that. And I think it was a very, very powerful thing. Unfortunately, I think actually the SDP has quite a lot of senior people who voted Remain and then joined our party afterwards, a reaction against the reaction to the vote. So, sort of democratic Remainers are an unsung group, I think. We wouldn't have had 2019. In fact, we wouldn't have got it over the line without them. But I see no sign that the sort of core 5%, 10% of rabid sort of EU files, they still don't get it. And Brendan, they will never get it.
No, absolutely not. It brings to mind at the countdown to Brexit in Westminster Square, I remember there was a woman there with a banner that said, this stupid northerner knew what she was voting for. And I thought that was such a perfect rebuke to all the Westminster lovies who were looking with utter disdain upon this gathering. But you mentioned Peter Shaw earlier on, and alongside Peter Shaw, there was also Barbara Castle. And when you talked about speaking at a university and students not understanding lefty students not understanding where you were coming from, it reminds me of a speech that Barbara Castle gave at the Oxford Union, I think, during the first referendum on joining the EEC. and she was making a very clear case against what she referred to as Euro-jingoism and the creation of this new monolith in Europe. And the students there had no idea where she was coming from. And no doubt they were all privately educated, had all the correct views, and they were kind of essentially laughing at her. So there was Peter Shaw, there was Barbara Castle, there was Tony Benn. Euroscepticism used to be a pretty left-wing phenomenon. And when I think of interesting Eurosceptics today, I think of people like you. I think of others around the SDP. I don't tend to think of the Singapore on the Thames brigade in the right, because I think they misunderstand Brexit. And
they totally do.
And if they think it's going to unleash a new free market zeal in the UK, they're sorely mistaken. So there has been this great tradition of left-leaning Euroscepticism or working-class Euroscepticism. Why do you think the Labour Party in particular became so estranged from that tradition to such an extent that if you say this to a young Labour activist in particular, they simply will not know what you're talking about?
I mean, you're quite right, okay, and it goes back earlier, much earlier than just, the 70s. I mean, and by the way, that the second part of that Oxford Union speech in 75 was Peter Shaw, which is the best speech, political speech, in my opinion, ever. Phenomenal speech, 21 minutes, absolutely phenomenal. Yeah. But it goes back earlier than that. Clement Attlee was a Eurosceptic. Hugh Gaitskell was a Eurosceptic. The famous 61 speech, the Labour Party conference, was written by Shaw, ending 1,000 years of history. It's basics. This is basics. I mean, you can't have national self-government unless you have a nation. It's just basic. So I think what happened, to cut a long story short, was I think during Thatcherism, I think that the famous Delors speech to the Labour Party conference sort of bought them off with progress. They thought, well, we can't achieve an electoral success against Thatcher, so we'll ask other people to do our job for us. Terrible way of doing politics. We're going to ask the EU to vouchsafe our own workers' rights and all this sort of. So they sort of bought the idea that the EU would sort of look after them, as be under the cloak. Instead of mastering their own destiny, they'd subcontract the job of having sort of workers' rights to the EU. And it was a con because the EU is just a cartel. It's just a neoliberal cartel. And it has a dreadful record. I mean, speak to someone like Thomas Fazzi, the Italian Eurosceptic of the left. You speak to anyone in Greece or Italy or Spain or Portugal on the fringe, and they'll talk about the EU. What the EU's done to them is deindustrialize them with 40% youth unemployment. Dreadful. And so, I mean, one of the reasons I got back into politics, 5 or 6 years ago, was I was walking on the beach in Portugal, and I speak Portuguese and I love Portugal, and they had lots of these little, on Bloco Esquerda, the left bloc, the big one, the Communist Party, which I don't subscribe to, but they had a lot of other ones that were just the sort of party I wish we had, strongly social solidarity, left econ and Eurosceptic, and they get it. So I think, but to summarize, Brendan, I think they were just taken in by just an idea of progress somehow, and they just forgot, and somehow the connections were lost.
Spiked is producing more brilliant content than ever. The best way to keep up with everything we do is by signing up for our daily newsletter. It's called Today on Spiked. Every weekday, you'll get a roundup of all Spike's content, plus some exclusive commentary from the Spiked team. So, to never miss a thing, go to spiked-online.com/newsletters and sign up to Today on Spiked. It always brings to mind Tony Benn's rebuke to left-wing supporters of the EU, where he would say, it's better to have a bad parliament than a good king. But of course, the problem is the EU wasn't even a good king, as you've outlined. It was a complete con. The idea that you could realize social democracy through the distant committees of the European Union because the ordinary voters of Britain were such a disappointment to you was always a fantastical con, because the European Union, as you describe, is a neoliberal cartel and not the midwife of anything that you and I would recognize as social democracy. Mm. But on that point that you talked about, which I think is incredibly important, the issue of solidarity, and just how important that is, how important it is in people's everyday lives. You know, as you said earlier, that working class communities know very well that you cannot get by without solidarity, without the assistance of your neighbors, of your friends, of your family. You know, these networks are incredibly important, which is why I think anything that's threatens those networks, whether it's big business that flies in for a couple of years and then abandons people afterwards, or the politics of wokeness, which says you've got white privilege, you're all gammon, and you need to realize how racist you are, which kind of tends to tear communities apart as well. All of those things, I think, are incredibly dangerous for communities that rely on solidarity effectively for their survival. But I want to ask you what you think are the main challenges to the culture of solidarity that we need. And firstly, on the politics of identity, I want to ask you what role you think the politics of identity plays and the whole notion of white privilege and these other ideas in terms of chipping away at how people conceive of themselves as a community.
Oh, they're utterly disastrous. The sad thing is that all these, CRT narratives that they push in cultural discourse and in schools and universities, they are really luxury opinions, Brendan, because the people that promote them are not feeling the effects. We may have different views on drugs, but it's like that. You have a liberal view, you push it, your community doesn't really pay the price for it, and that's it. I mean, a lot of the virtue signaling and all the sort of woke politics that we have to deal with are pumped by. But it's like a sort of status appropriation game amongst very elite people. You're just seeing how virtuous you can be, but the consequences of dividing people, putting one group against another, preoccupation, constant raising the racial temperature over everything, and they forget that most of us have quite diverse families ourselves. We don't want to live with this, right? We don't want to have to put up with it, and we haven't asked for it either. That's the astonishing thing. This is very much after BLM. This wave, this sort of moral panic. It's the first time I've seen a proper sort of, moral panic. Obviously, it was interlinked with the pandemic, but you had this importation of American racialized hyper-racialism, and overnight, and it was sort of washed over British society so quickly, and the absurdity of BLM activists in the UK saying don't shoot and all this sort of thing. And actually, it was astonishing. I touched on it in my speech. There's something seriously wrong when a plain falsehood is not able to be challenged in cultural discourse. You see this. I'll give you an example. So, in the months before the Iraq invasion, the Iraq war, half of the American public thought that Iraqis were involved in the 9/11 attacks, and they weren't. But half of the American public thought they were. And so look at BLM and look at a racial disparity in police shootings. Eric Kaufman produced some figures in Unheard saying that among liberal Americans, the well-educated types, the university educated, among liberal Americans, about half of them thought the number of unarmed black people killed by American cops was between 1,000 and 10,000. Yeah? Now, the figure for 2019 is 13, or on a wider conception is 27. 13 too many, but that's such a wide disparity between reality and what their opinion was that something seriously has gone wrong, and I think the media is culpable. I think WAPO and the New York Times are a disgrace, and I think you just have to fight against this and have the courage. But there was a time when last summer with BLM that Ben Cobley and I were sort of writing on SDP Talks and dealing with it. And I said to Ben, just let's just be honest. Just have a look at the program and see what we think of it and then say what we think of it. And that's what we did. But it became very, very difficult to do it in the environment. And I think we did the right thing. But, you're sort of crying in the wilderness against some of this stuff. But it's very, to go back to what you're saying, it's almost as if, some of the very big players in media and big tech and the rest of it are literally wanting to destroy solidarity and to raise the temperature. And I just think it's desperately dangerous.
And it seems so clearly, I don't mean this in a conspiratorial sense, I'm sure it's all entirely accidental or opportunistic rather, but it seems so clearly to grate against class solidarity in particular. So I've always been struck by the fact that big business, and by big business I mean some of the most powerful corporations on earth, are very amenable to the new politics of racial identity. So they're very amenable to the whole idea of white privilege, and they invite people like Robin DiAngelo, who writes books about white fragility, and other people who pontificate on issues of whiteness. They often invite these people to speak to their employees and institute programs through which employees might be reprimanded and controlled on the issue of race and the issue of whiteness and so on. And for me, the great thing about class politics, as it was traditionally understood, was its universalizing dynamic. So if you were working class, I mean, obviously there were racial tensions in the 20th century, but once those racial tensions had been resolved and anti-racist campaigns had been successful, the idea was that if you were working class, it didn't matter where you came from. It didn't matter what skin color you had. It didn't matter what sex you were or what sexuality you were. The thing that drew you together with other people was your status in society and your interest in making sure that you had good working conditions, good pay, the ability to buy a home, the ability to have a comfortable life. So you were drawn together not by your racial connections or your sexual connections or any of those other identitarian concerns, but by your community interest in struggling for a particular idea or for a greater sense of solidarity. So identity politics, the thing that really I find very frustrating when I speak to young leftists who will wave around books by Karl Marx and talk about how radical and revolutionary they are, is that I think they misunderstand how much they're playing into a new form of politics that openly undermines the ability of working class people to make gains in their lives.
Totally. No, that's brilliantly put. I think that's exactly, you see it in so many areas. The more you have a preoccupation with identitarian concerns and hyper-racialism, the less you're talking about housing, the less you're talking about industry. The big thing, we produced a green paper, The End of Indifference, in November, and it's a brilliant bit of work by our economists. And it basically talks about how we had a post-war economy that was based on industrial production and investment, and the employment rates and the growth rates, despite the fact that it's disparaged, were actually far better than after the neoliberal turn, after Thatcher got in. Far better. I mean, the actual record of post-1979 economics is dismal. I mean, it's based on debt. I mean, you've got an economy that's just laced with debt at every single sector. Individuals are up to their necks in debt, households, government, corporations, debt, everything. And it acts as a drag anchor on investment and growth. And so the results have been desperate. So, no, we as a party, we talk about housing all the time. And I sometimes get, people accuse me of talking about nothing else, but I'm afraid to say that has such a big effect on people's lives. You take out, what's happened is, 42% of people lived in council houses in 79 when Thatcher got in. Now it's 8%. The estate capacity in house building is gone. Anyone in the southeast particularly has very little chance of getting a family, getting a house, and these people are elected calling themselves conservatives. It's a disgrace. And so any of this stuff distracts from basics, industry and housing. And that's what left econ politics used to be about. And Labour Party members and MPs just don't talk about these things anymore. But I totally agree. I think you're completely right. The people are useful idiots. I mean, all these kids. I put a piece in a magazine called Born recently about Rashford, who I think is a good lad. I think he's a nice lad. He means well. But he can't talk about anything serious. His media team won't really get him to talk about anything serious. Don't talk about family stability or anything like that, as a cause of poverty. He won't want to go there. But what he will do is take the knee before a game like all the other footballers, but he won't talk about the thousands of people that are having kidney failure and have died on the sites making the Qatar World Cup. If they cared, Brendan, if they cared about the World Cup, if they cared about inequality, they wouldn't go. They wouldn't be going to Qatar. So this is the problem. It is a total distraction. These are luxury opinions, and the fact that so many very, very rich corporations and individuals have embraced this stuff should be a little indicator that, it suits them. It gets people off the subject of economic inequality.
Absolutely. I think luxury opinions is a very good way of describing it. Okay, as we come to the end of the conversation, I want to ask you about the issue of wokeness a little bit more, because, who knows what that even means? But I think people have a general sense of what it means, which is it's a new term for political correctness, for identity politics, for ensuring that you have the correct opinions and punishing anyone who doesn't have the correct opinions. That's generally how wokeness is understood. And I think the SDP has been probably the bravest of all the parties in terms of taking a position on some of these issues, a position that is not a kind of hardcore culture war position, but is often a very humanist position. So, for example, one thing I wanted to ask you was about the issue of gender fluidity or transgenderism, or however we want to refer to it. And the SDP's position, as I understand, is that, of course, trans people should have the same rights as everyone else, and particularly the right to a dignified life. But at the same time, there is clearly a problem with forcing everyone to genuflect to the idea that you can change sex, and particularly with forcing women to throw open what were traditionally women-only spaces to people who we could reasonably refer to as men or as biological males or as people who were certainly born male. So just explain how you see that issue and why you think it's become such a difficult issue for us to have a discussion about today.
There are so many layers to it. It is a very interesting issue. I'm a second-rate philosopher, so I love categories, and I am very interested in these things. So, if you just take it from the start, I think the project to change the meaning of a term like woman or girl without consent of half the population that use the term to provide meaning is slightly impudent anyway. To say, well, I'm going to change the definition of the category, the meaning of the term without consulting you, really asking you. But yeah, our basic approach. There are some people that are trans, and that's not really, shouldn't really be a problem in a very liberal society like ours, as long as you respect that there are some boundaries, and as long as you accept that biological sex, particularly female biological sex, has some salience. You can't just pretend that a declaration that if I said or you said I'm a woman, that gives us access to any place, any physical place, or a sporting podium, or a changing room. It can't, and women, biological women, are going to say no. We don't accept that. But I think you've got an inflation away from that question, which is a question which we as a party looked at seriously. We convened the experts, a lot of published authors, very eminent people who've been in the news recently, helped us with it. Our own trans members helped us with it, and we got the policy right. Just have a look on the website. It's a very humane policy, very reasonable policy. But you've got an inflation, Brendan, because then it becomes about this sort of ultra progressive project of woke, and there you're just getting into language control. You're getting into, you step out of line on what I say something is, and you're just going to get hammered, for having a different opinion, and having an opinion which is, in this case, well grounded in biological reality and scientific reality. So and I think there are some signs recently that the aggressive side of that are overreaching, and I think people are seeing that's wrong. And I'm reasonably optimistic on this. But Kathleen Stock was going to come, and she was booked to speak at the conference. She couldn't come because what happened. And I would say I always like to try and talk about solutions. Just don't talk about problems. So what are the solutions? Well, I think a lot of the problems with these things, luxury opinions and woke people wandering around saying things, big corporations doing things. I think ultimately there have to be some consequences. Otherwise, you can do what the hell you like. And I think the consequent, Manik Govinda wrote our arts policy last year. And the arts policy is you start banning or selecting particular exhibits or whatever, you just lose your funding. You just lose your funding. We won't fund. The government shouldn't fund arts organizations that start doing that. And by the same token, a university that presides over a situation where a decent, philosopher in the Western analytic tradition gets hounded off campus by a mob, you've got to lose funding. There's got to be some consequence. And the Tories are quite poor on this. And remember, we've had a Conservative government, and I know a lot of this, I realise a lot of this stuff's downstream of culture. I get that. Politicians are scrappling around, reacting to things. They don't always cause them, but they've got to be more muscular. We've got academics. This happened after Brexit. A lot of the lecturers in the party that copped it after supporting Brexit, and they had colleagues say, "Oh, I believe, I agree with you, but I can't come out." I think there's got to be some consequence to that sort of effectively oppression of other people's opinions. And I think that the obvious thing is to take funding away. I think the state has to be really muscular with this stuff.
That brings me on to my final question, which is probably too big a question to answer in a few minutes, but let's give it a whirl. So you talk there about the need to be more muscular in relation to these issues, and I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that struck me about Boris Johnson's government is that it's continually being accused of launching a war on woke, but it's not at all clear that it has done that. And in many cases, it's actually capitulated to wokeness, or at least been very cagey about criticizing it. And I'm thinking in particular of the bizarre cervix controversy, where Keir Starmer was unwilling to say only women have a cervix. And then Boris Johnson and ahed about the very same question. So the idea that he is this warrior against wokeness really does not stack up at all. No. So in terms of that need for a more muscular approach to these issues in order to defend the right of people to express their opinions and defend the right of philosophers like Kathleen Stock and other people in public life to criticize the ideology of transgenderism, to stand up for women's rights, or other people to say, I voted for Brexit and I'm proud of having voted for Brexit. That culture of openness and that culture of freedom of speech seems to me to be, in many ways, the starting point of the kinds of changes in political life that people like me and you want to see. Yeah. So how essential do you see freedom of speech or freedom of conscience being? And as a final point, what do you think we can do to try and restore some of those ideas?
As I said before, I think government does have a role, and I think there is some movement on that now, for instance, to try and guarantee freedom of speech in educational establishments and link it to funding. So I think you've got to do that. I think there are some good signs in the younger generation, actually, not millennials, the younger ones. Than that, who can sort of smell the air and see that actually, if there's a rebellion to be had, it's against some of the values of their parents, and so I'm quite encouraged. Actually, I'm quite encouraged. A lot of these things are cyclic. I'm not complacent. I think you've got, I think there's a long way to go, and some people say just wait until. I mean, at the moment, the very hyper progressive wokey type people are on the social media platforms, aren't they? And the heads of the organizations are people my age, and they're terrified of them, and they're not asserting it. And then people say, well, just wait until these people actually get to the power. It might get very serious, but like most of these things, there's no future. There's no future in despising your own culture. This is a total luxury. I think reality, Brendan, when something has a poor correspondence to reality, it usually gets a brutal wake-up call, and I hope that that's what will basically happen. And apart from anything else, we've just got to keep on trucking and enjoy trucking.
William, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Brendan. Take care.
Thank you for listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. We'll be back with another guest and more discussion. Don't forget to subscribe, and in the meantime, keep reading Spiked at www.spiked-online.com.